Chapter 17. It all seemed so tedious. The snow and cold they had endured on the journey to Prolgu had numbed Sinadra, and the warmth here in the caverns made her drowsy. The endless, obscure talk of Belgarath and the strange, frail old Gorim seemed to pull her towards sleep. The peculiar singing began again somewhere, echoing endlessly through the caves, and that too lulled her. Only a lifetime of training in the involved etiquette of court behavior kept her awake. The journey had been ghastly for Sinadra. Tal Hanith was a warm city, and she was not accustomed to cold weather. It seemed that her feet would never be warm again. She had also discovered a world filled with shocks, terrors, and unpleasant surprises. At the imperial palace in Tal Hanith, the enormous power of her father, the emperor, had shielded her from danger of any kind, but now she felt vulnerable. In a rare moment of absolute truth with herself, she had admitted that much of her spiteful behavior toward Geryon had grown out of her dreadful new sense of insecurity. Her safe, pampered little world had been snatched away from her, and she felt exposed, unprotected, and afraid. Poor Geryon, she thought. He was such a nice boy. She felt a little ashamed that he had been the one who'd had to suffer from her bad temper. She promised herself that soon, very soon, she would sit down with him and explain it all. He was a sensible boy, and he'd be sure to understand. That, of course, would immediately patch up the rift which had grown between them. Feeling her eyes on him, he glanced at her, and then looked away with an apparent indifference. Sinadra's eyes hardened like agates. How dared he! She made a mental note of it, and added it to her list of many imperfections. The frail-looking old Gorim had sent one of the strange, silent Ulgos to fetch the man he and Belgarath and Lady Pulgera had been discussing, and then they turned to more general topics. "Were you able to pass through the mountains unmolested?" the Gorim asked.
"We had a few encounters,"
Beric, the big, red-bearded Earl of Trailham, replied, with what seemed to Sinadra a gross understatement. "But thanks to Ull, you're all safe," the Gorim declared piously. "Which of the monsters are still abroad at this season? I haven't been out of the caves in years, but as I recall, most of them seek their lairs when the snow begins."
"We encountered Hrolgin, Holy One," Baron Mandaralin informed him, "and some Ulgroths, and there was an Eldarak." "The Eldarak was troublesome," Silk said dryly.
"Understandably. Fortunately, there aren't very many Eldrakian. They're fearsome monsters."
"We noticed that," Silk said.
"Which one was it?" "Grull," Belgarath replied. "He and I had met before, and he seemed to hold a grudge. I'm sorry, Gorim, but we had to kill him. There wasn't any other way." "Ah," the Gorim said with a slight note of pain in his voice. "Poor Grull."
"I personally don't miss him very much," Beric said. "I'm not trying to be forward, Holy One, but don't you think it might be a good idea to exterminate some of the more troublesome beasts in these mountains?"
"They're the children of Ull, even as we," the Gorim explained.
"But if they weren't out there, you could return to the world above," Beric pointed out.
The Gorim smiled at that. "No," he said gently. "Olga will never leave the caves now. We've dwelt here for 5 millennia, and over the years we've changed. Our eyes could not bear the sunlight now. The monsters above cannot reach us here, and their presence in the mountains keeps strangers out of Ulgo. We're not at ease with strangers, really, so it's probably for the best." The Gorim was sitting directly across the narrow stone table with Sinadra. The subject of the monsters obviously pained him, and he looked at her for a moment, then gently reached out his frail old hand and cupped her little chin in it, lifting her face to the dim light of the hanging globe suspended above the table. "All of the alien creatures are not monsters," he said, his large violet eyes calm and very wise. "Consider the beauty of this dryad." Sinadra was a little startled, not by his touch, certainly, for older people had responded to her flower-like face with the same gesture for as long as she could remember, but rather by the ancient man's immediate recognition of the fact that she was not entirely human. "Tell me, child," the Gorim asked, "do the Dryads still honor Ull?" She was completely unprepared for the question. I'm sorry, Holy One," she floundered. Until quite recently, I'd never even heard of the god Ull." For some reason, my tutors have very little information about your people or your god. The princess was raised as a Talnadran, Lady Polgara explained. She's a Baroon. I'm sure you've heard of the link between that house and the Dryads. As a Talnadran, her religious affiliation is to Nadra. A serviceable god, the Gorim said, perhaps a bit stuffy for my taste, but certainly adequate. The Dryads themselves, though, do they still know their god? Belgraf coughed a bit apologetically. I'm afraid not, Gorim. They've drifted away, and the eons have erased what they knew of all. They're flighty creatures, anyway, not much given to religious observances. The Gorim's face was sad. What god do they honor now? None, actually, Belgrath admitted. They have a few sacred groves, a rough idol or two fashioned from the root of a particularly venerated tree. That's about it. They don't really have any clearly formulated theology. Sinadra found the whole discussion a trifle offensive. Rising to the occasion, she drew herself up slightly and smiled winsomely at the old Gorim. She knew exactly how to charm an elderly man. She practiced for years on her father. I feel the shortcomings of my education most keenly, Holy One, she lied. Since mysterious Ul is the hereditary god of the Dryads, I should know him. I hope that some day soon I may receive instruction concerning him. It may be that I, unworthy though I am, can be the instrument of renewing the allegiance of my sisters to their rightful god. It was an artful little speech, and on the whole, Sinadra was rather proud of it. To her surprise, however, the Gorim was not satisfied to accept a vague expression of interest and let it go at that. Tell your sisters that the core of our faith is to be found in the Book of Ulgo, he told her seriously. The Book of Ulgo, she repeated. I must remember that. As soon as I return to Talhadith, I'll obtain a copy and deliver it to the Wood of the Dryads personally. That, she thought, would satisfy him. I'm afraid that such copies as you'd find in Talhadith would be corrupted, the Gorim told her. The tongue of my people is not easily understood by strangers, and translations are difficult. Sinadra definitely felt that the dear old man was becoming just a bit tiresome about the whole thing. As is so often the case with scriptures, he was saying, our holy book is bound up in our history. The wisdom of the gods is such that the instruction is concealed within stories. Our minds delight in the stories, and the messages of the gods are implanted thus. All unaware, we are instructed even as we are entertained. Sinadra was familiar with the theory. Master Jeevers, her tutor, had lectured her tediously concerning it. She cast about rather desperately, trying to find some graceful way to change the subject. Our story is very old, the Gorim continued inexorably. Would you like to hear it? Caught by her own cleverness, Sinadra could only nod helplessly. And so the Gorim began. At the beginning of days, when the world was spun out of darkness by the wayward gods, there dwelt in the silences of the heavens a spirit known only as Ul. In utter dismay, Sinadra realized that he fully intended to recite the entire book to her. After a few moments of chagrin, however, she began to feel the strangely compelling quality of his story. More than she would have cared to admit, she was moved by the first Gorim's appeal to the indifferent spirit that appeared to him at Prolgu. What manner of man would thus dare to accuse a god? As she listened, a faint flicker seemed to tug at the corner of her eye. She glanced toward it, and saw a soft glow somewhere deep within the massive rocks that formed one of the walls of the chamber. The glow was peculiarly different from the dim light of the hanging crystal globes. Then the heart of the Gorim was made glad, the old man continued his recitation, and he called the name of the high place where all this had come to pass Prolgu, which is holy place, and he departed from Prolgu and returned unto Yagarak Tek Gorim. The words were spat out in a snarling Ulgo language, and the harsh voice that spoke them was filled with outrage. Sinadra jerked her head around to look at the intruder. Like all Ulgos, he was short, but his arms and shoulders were so massively developed that he seemed almost deformed. His colorless hair was tangled and unkempt. He wore a hooded leather smock, stained and smeared with some kind of mud, and his large black eyes burned with fanaticism. Crowded behind him were a dozen or more other Ulgos, their faces set in expressions of shock and righteous indignation. The fanatic in the leather smock continued his stream of crackling vituperation. The Gorim's face set. but he endured the abuse from the wild-eyed man in the door patiently. Finally, when the fanatic paused for breath, the frail old man turned to Belgrath. "This is Relg," he said a bit apologetically. "You see what I mean about him. Trying to convince him of anything is impossible."
"What use would he be to us?" Barak demanded, obviously irritated by the newcomer's attitude. "He can't even speak a civilized tongue."
Relg glared at him. "I speak your language, foreigner," he said with towering contempt, "but I choose not to defile the holy caverns with its unsanctified mouthings." He turned back to Gorim. "Who gave you the right to speak the words of the holy book to unbelieving foreigners?" he demanded. The gentle old Gorim's eyes hardened slightly. "I think that's about enough, Relg," he said firmly. "Whatever idiocies you barble in out-of-the-way galleries to those gullible enough to listen is your concern. But what you say to me in my house is mine. I am still Gorim in Ulgo, whatever you may think, and I am not required to answer to you." He looked past Relg at the shocked faces of the zealot's followers. "This is not a general audience," he informed Relg. "You were summoned here. They were not. Send them away." "They came to be sure you intended me no harm," Relg replied stiffly. "I have spoken the truth about you, and powerful men fear the truth." "Relg," the Gorm said in an icy voice, "I don't think you could even begin to realize how indifferent I am to anything you might have said about me. Now send them away, or would you rather have me do it?" "They won't obey you," Relg sneered. "I am their leader." The Gorm's eyes narrowed, and he rose to his feet. Then he spoke in the Ulgo tongue directly to Relg's adherents. Sinedra could not understand his words, but she did not really need to. She recognized the tone of authority instantly, and she was a bit startled at how absolutely the saintly old Gorim used it. Not even her father would have dared to speak in that tone. The men crowded behind Relg looked nervously at each other and began to back away, their faces frightened. The Gorim barked one final command, and Relg's followers turned and fled. Relg scowled after them and seemed for a moment on the verge of raising his voice to call them back, but apparently thought better of it. "You go too far, Gorim," he accused. "That authority is not meant to be used in worldly matters." "That authority is mine, Relg," the Gorim replied, "and it's up to me to decide when it's required. You've chosen to confront me on theological ground, therefore I needed to remind your followers, and you, just who I am." "Why have you summoned me here?" Relg demanded. "The presence of these unsanctified ones is an affront to my purity." "I require your service, Relg," the Gorim told him. "These strangers go to battle against our ancient foe, the one accursed above all others. The fate of the world hangs upon their quest, and your aid is needed." "What do I care about the world?" Relg's voice was filled with contempt. "And what do I care about maimed Torak? I am safe within the hand of Ul. He has need of me here, and I will not go from the holy caverns to risk defilement in the lewd company of unbelievers and monsters." "The entire world will be defiled if Torak gains dominion over it," Belgrath pointed out, "and if we fail, Torak will become king of the world." "He will not reign in Ulgo," Relg retorted. "How little you know him," Hulgara murmured. "I will not leave the caves," Relg insisted. "The coming of the child is at hand, and I have been chosen to reveal him to Ulgo, and to guide and instruct him until he is ready to become Gorim." "How interesting," the Gorim observed dryly. "Just who was it who advised you of your election?" "Ul spoke to me," Relg declared. "Odd. The caverns respond universally to the voice of Ul. All Ulgo would have heard his voice. He spoke to me in my heart," Relg replied quickly. "What a curious thing for him to do," the Gorim answered mildly. "All of this is beside the point," Belgrath said brusquely. "I'd prefer to have you join us willingly, Relg, but willingly or not, you will join us. A power greater than any of us commands it. You can argue and resist as much as you like, but when we leave, you'll be going with us." Relg spat. "Never! I will remain here in the service of Ul, and of the child who will become Gorim of Ulgo. And if you try to compel me, my followers will not permit it."
"Why do we need this blind mole, Belgrath?" Barak asked. He's just going to be an aggravation to us. I've noticed that men who spend all their time congratulating themselves on their sanctity tend to be very poor companions. And what can this one do that I can't?
Relg looked at the red-bearded giant with disdain. Big men with big mouths seldom have big brains, he said. Watch closely, hairy one. He walked over to the sloping wall of the chamber. Can you do this? He asked, and slowly pushed his hand directly into the rock as if he were sinking it into water. Silk whistled with amazement and moved quickly over to the wall beside the fanatic. As Relg pulled his hand out of the rock, Silk reached out to put his hand on the precise spot. How did you do that? He demanded, shoving at the stones. Relg laughed harshly and turned his back. That's the ability that makes him useful to us, Silk, Belgraf explained. Relg's a diviner. He finds caves, and we need to locate the caves under Rakthal. If necessary, Relg can walk through the solid rock to find them for us. How could anyone do that? Silk asked, still staring at the spot where Relg had sunk his hand into the wall. It has to do with the nature of matter, the sorcerer replied. What we see as solid isn't really all that impenetrable. Either something solid or it's not, Silk insisted, his face baffled. Solidity is an illusion, Belgraf told him. Relg can slip the bits and pieces that make up his substance through the spaces that exist between the bits and pieces that make up the substance of the rock. Can you do it? Silk demanded skeptically. Belgraf shrugged. I don't know. I've never had occasion to try. Anyway, Relg can smell caves, and he goes straight to them. He probably doesn't know himself how he does it. I am led by my sanctity, Relg declared arrogantly. Perhaps that's it, the sorcerer agreed with a tolerant smile. The holiness of the caves draws me. Since I am drawn to all holy things, Relg rasped on, and for me to leave the caverns of Ulgo would be to turn my back on holiness and move toward defilement. We'll see, Belgraf told him. The glow in the rock wall, which Sinedra had noticed before, began to shimmer and pulsate, and the princess seemed to see a dim shape within the rocks. Then, as if the stones were only air, the shape became distinct and stepped out into the chamber. For just a moment, it seemed that the figure was an old man, bearded and robed like the Gorim, although much more robust. Then Sinedra was struck by an overpowering sense of something more than human. With an odd shudder, she realized that she was in the presence of divinity. Relg gasped at the bearded figure, and he began to tremble violently. With a strangled cry, he prostrated himself. The figure looked calmly at the groveling zealot. Rise, Relg, it said in a soft voice that seemed to carry all the echoes of eternity in it, and the caverns outside rang with the sound of that voice. Rise, Relg, and serve thy god.